The room fell into a heavy, absolute silence the moment the man on the phone spoke those words. "Yes, ma'am. We'll move forward under your command." I could feel Daniel's mother's eyes locked on me, sharp, piercing, and clouded with confusion. Across the table, his father had just set down his fork. The faint clink of silver against porcelain echoed, much louder than it should have in that pristine, suffocatingly quiet dining room. No one said a word. Not yet. I remained standing by the hallway table, my back straight and my voice steady as I delivered my final instruction. "Keep the situation contained until I get back. I will review every detail personally." "Yes, ma'am." The call ended. When I finally turned around, every face at that table had shifted. It was in that moment of collective shock that I realized I hadn't truly planned for the aftermath of being found out. 3 hours earlier, I had stood before my closet, holding two very different lives in my hands. One was a navy blue, tailored dress, the kind I wore to high-level official functions when I needed to represent more than just myself. The other was older, made of soft cotton and slightly faded at the seams. It was a piece I hadn't worn in years, but couldn't bring myself to discard. I chose the old one. It wasn't a mistake, it was a calculated decision. I slipped it on slowly, smoothing the fabric over my hips as I caught my reflection in the mirror. No insignia, no polished shoes, no trace of rank or authority. In the glass stood a woman in her late 30s with a simple dress and a calm, unassuming expression. I pulled my hair back into a low, practical style, not the tight, regulation bun I wore on base, but something softer and less defined. I kept my makeup minimal, almost invisible. When I stepped into the living room, Daniel looked up from his phone and paused, his brow furrowing slightly. "Are you sure about that?" he asked. I offered a light smile. "It's just dinner, Daniel." He hesitated. That small, lingering pause told me everything I needed to know. Daniel loved me, of that I was certain. But he also came from a world where appearances were the primary currency. His parents had built their lives around status, what you did, how you looked, and who you were connected to. It wasn't exactly cruel, it was simply ingrained in their DNA. "I was thinking," I said as I slipped on my shoes, "that I might keep things simple tonight." "Simple how?" "I'll just tell them I work in administration for the army." He blinked, clearly caught off guard. "That's not exactly the full picture." "No," I replied calmly. "It isn't." He studied me for a long moment, searching my face for a motive. "Why?" I picked up my coat and met his gaze directly. "Because I want to know who they are before they know who I am." That answer didn't sit comfortably with him. I could see the unease in the way his shoulders shifted. "They're good people," he insisted. "Just traditional." "I'm not trying to trick anyone," I replied. "I just don't feel like leading with a title tonight." He nodded slowly, though the doubt never quite left his eyes. "All right. But if things get weird, I'll handle it." The drive to his parents' house took about 40 minutes. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the highway, bathing the world in a quiet, golden hue. Daniel kept one hand on the wheel and the other resting near mine, though we didn't speak much. I didn't mind the silence, I used it. In my line of work, you learn to read a situation long before you step into it. You learn to listen for the things that aren't being said. And tonight, I had a feeling there would be plenty of that. When we pulled into the driveway, I took a breath before opening the car door. The house was large, but lacked flash, clean lines, and a perfectly manicured lawn. It was a place built to signal success without needing to shout. It was the kind of home where expectations lived within the very walls. Daniel walked around and opened the door for me, a polite, practiced gesture. "You ready?" he asked. I nodded. "Always." His mother opened the front door before we even had a chance to knock. "Daniel," she said warmly, pulling him into a brief embrace before her attention pivoted to me. Her smile remained, but it shifted, becoming more clinical. "And you must be Emily," I said, offering my hand. She took it, her grip light and fleeting, while her eyes performed a quick, efficient scan. Dress, shoes, hair. No judgment was spoken aloud, but I recognized that look. It was an audit. "Welcome," she said, stepping aside. His father was waiting in the living room. He didn't move toward us immediately, choosing instead to observe our entrance from a distance. "Dad," Daniel said. "This is Emily." I extended my hand again. "It's a pleasure to meet you, sir." He shook it firmly. "You as well." His tone was neutral, perfectly controlled. After a few polite formalities, we moved into the sitting area. The room was arranged with surgical precision. Every piece of furniture was in its proper place, every surface gleaming. His mother offered drinks, and I accepted a glass of water. "So, Emily," she began after settling into her chair. "Daniel mentioned you're in the military." "Yes, ma'am." "And what is it you do, exactly?" There it was. The question. I kept my voice perfectly even. "I work in administration for the Army." A small pause followed, just long enough to feel the air thin. "I see," she said. His father leaned back slightly, nodding as if confirming a suspicion. "That must be very stable work." "It is." The conversation moved on, but the shift was undeniable. I felt it in the way his mother's questions moved from curiosity to evaluation. I felt it in the way his father stopped asking follow-up questions and in the subtle, almost invisible recalibration of their expectations. I was no longer a potential peer. I was a subordinate. Daniel noticed it too. I saw his jaw tighten, but he remained silent. For now. By the time we transitioned to the dining table, the tone had settled into something quiet and controlled. His mother had prepared a lavish meal, roast chicken, seasonal vegetables, and fresh bread, everything placed with mathematical exactness. We sat, and I waited. I had seen this before, though usually not in a dining room. I had been in plenty of rooms where people made decisions based on what they thought you were worth. The only difference was that this time, I had chosen to let them. I picked up my fork, my hand as steady as ever, and smiled across the table. "Thank you for having me." Deep down, I knew this dinner was going to reveal far more than anyone expected. It began like most formal family affairs, polite, shallow conversation accompanied by the soft clinking of silverware. For the first few minutes, nothing of substance was said. Daniel's mother passed the bread basket with practiced grace. "Emily, please, help yourself." Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you," I replied. His father carved the chicken with the precision of a man who followed the same routine for decades. There was a rhythm to this table, a tempo that didn't yet have a place for me. I waited. People rarely show their true selves in the first 5 minutes. The truth only comes out once they get comfortable with their own assumptions. "So," his mother said, finally settling in. "How long have you been in the Army?" "A little over 15 years, I answered. She raised her eyebrows. "That's quite a long time for administrative work." "I've moved around a bit," I said vaguely. "Different assignments, different locations." His father nodded, though there was a calculating look in his eyes. "And do you plan to stay in that role?" "For now, yes." Another pause. Another shift in the room's pressure. Daniel cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. "Emily's work is actually a bit more complicated than that." "It's all right, Daniel," I said, placing a hand lightly on his wrist. "I'm comfortable with what I do." That silenced him, but the exchange didn't go unnoticed. His mother offered a polite, thin smile. "Of course. Stability is so important, especially for a young couple looking toward the future." There it was again, the layered comment. Not openly rude, but heavy with implication. "I agree," I said simply. "She studied me for a beat too long." "And your family? Are they nearby?" "No, ma'am. They're in Ohio." "Oh," she said, her tone softening into something patronizing. "A small town?" "Yes." It must have been quite an adjustment, moving into all of this. She gestured vaguely at the expensive room. "It was," I replied. "But you get used to change." Across the table, I could feel the tension radiating off Daniel. It wasn't explosive, but it was persistent, like the pressure building behind a dam. His father took a slow sip of wine before continuing the interrogation. "Daniel mentioned you met through mutual friends." "Yes, sir." "And you've been together how long?" "Just over a year." "A year isn't very long," he noted. "No," I agreed. "It isn't." His mother set her fork down. "You'll have to forgive us," she said with a forced laugh. "We're just very protective of our son. Daniel has always been very driven. We've always encouraged him to aim high." "I can see that." And we want to ensure he has a partner who can support that drive. It was said gently, but the message was loud and clear. Asterisk, are you good enough to stand beside him? I met her gaze. Support comes in many forms. Her smile tightened. Of course. Mom, Daniel started to intervene. It's all right, I said, my voice calm but firm. I appreciate your honesty. The table fell silent. His father leaned back, folding his hands. In our experience, shared ambition is vital in a marriage. I agree, I said, which seemed to surprise him. But ambition doesn't always look the same from the outside. And what does it look like for you? He challenged. I took a moment to consider. It looks like commitment. Consistency. Doing the job well even when no one is watching. That sounds admirable, his mother chimed in. Though perhaps not particularly visible. I allowed a small, knowing smile. Not everything that matters is visible. The silence that followed felt different, less like evaluation and more like active resistance. Halfway through the meal, Daniel's cousin, Mark, arrived. He was in his late 30s, loud and boisterous, the kind of man who took up all the oxygen in a room. Sorry I'm late, he announced, dropping into the seat next to me. Work ran long. He gave me a quick, dismissive glance. You must be Emily. Yes. Mark, he said, shaking my hand briefly. I've heard a little about you. Only the good parts, I hope. He laughed. Depends on who you ask. Within minutes, Mark had hijacked the conversation, steering it toward high-stakes business investments and career trajectories. Eventually, the spotlight swung back to me. So, Emily, Mark said, leaning back. What do you do again? Administration in the Army, Daniel's mother answered for me. Mark raised his eyebrows, a smirk playing on his lips. Paperwork, huh? Filing and such. Among other things, I said. Well, he chuckled, someone's got to keep the machine running. I always figured the real action was somewhere else, though. It depends on what you consider action, I replied. He waved me off, clearly losing interest. From that point on, I became background noise. Questions were no longer directed at me. The conversation flowed around me as if I were a ghost. They had made their decision. I had been filed away under unremarkable. Daniel tried to pull me back in a few times. Emily actually has a great deal of responsibility, he said. But his voice lacked the necessary weight to change the room's momentum. I didn't push it. I was busy watching, listening, and learning who these people really were. Toward the end of the meal, his mother brought out dessert. Emily, do you cook? She asked, setting a plate of pie before me. Yes, ma'am. What kind of dishes? Simple ones. Things I grew up with. She nodded. That's nice. Daniel's schedule can be quite demanding. He'll need someone who can manage a home efficiently. I looked at her steadily. I've managed systems far more complex than a household. The words slipped out before I could soften them. Her smile didn't waver, but her eyes grew cold. I'm sure you have, she said, her tone implying the exact opposite. As the plates were cleared, the air in the house didn't ease. It solidified. Daniel walked me toward the hallway while his parents retreated to the kitchen. I'm sorry, he whispered. For what? They're just like that. I know. You didn't have to let them talk to you like that. I did, I said softly. He looked at me, searching for an explanation he couldn't grasp. Did what? I let them show me who they are. Before he could reply, my phone vibrated. I glanced at the screen and my entire demeanor shifted instantly. I knew that number. Calls from that line didn't happen without a dire reason. Excuse me, I said, stepping into a quiet corner of the hallway. I answered with a single word. Yes. The voice on the other end was urgent but professional. Ma'am, we have a situation developing. We need your guidance. What's the scope? I asked, my voice dropping into its natural command tone. Preliminary reports indicate a containment issue on the south side of the base. It's not public yet, but it's escalating fast. Command is asking for direction. I closed my eyes for a second, shifting into a headspace of controlled pressure and tactical decisions. Who's on site? Colonel Harris. He's waiting for authorization to move resources. Tell him he has it, I said firmly. But keep it contained. No unnecessary exposure. I want a full report within the hour. And keep this off open channels. Understood, ma'am. I hung up and let the shift settle. When I walked back into the dining room, the atmosphere had changed. They weren't just judging me anymore. They were watching me with a new, sharp curiosity. Everything all right? His mother asked. Yes, ma'am, I said, taking my seat. Just a work matter. Must be important, Mark added sarcastically. Sounded serious. Sometimes it is, I replied. His father wasn't letting it go. What exactly do you handle, Emily? I folded my hands in my lap. Administrative coordination. At this hour? Work doesn't always follow a schedule. The evening moved to the sitting room for coffee, but the tension was now an active force. Daniel sat closer to me than before, sensing the change in me. His father took his usual chair and cut straight to the point. Daniel tells us you've been considering next steps. Marriage is a serious commitment, Emily. It requires alignment in lifestyle, expectations, and long-term planning. I agree. And do you feel your current role supports that? The question wasn't about my job, it was about my value. I believe I bring stability, discipline, and commitment to any situation I'm part of, I said. His father leaned forward. I'm just not sure how your position fits into the future Daniel is building. Dad, Daniel warned. It's a fair question, I said calmly. You're asking if I meet your expectations. I'm asking if you're evaluating me based on who I am, or what you assume I am. The room went dead silent. Mark stopped smirking. Daniel's mother set her cup down with a trembling hand. And which do you think it is? His father asked. I think you've made a decision without having all the information. Then perhaps you should provide it, he challenged. I could feel the moment of truth approaching. I had planned to leave quietly, but plans change under pressure. His mother spoke up, her voice softer, but still pointed. Emily, we just want what's best for Daniel. And from what we've seen, we aren't sure you align with that. I took a slow breath of clarity. They weren't bad people. They were just certain of a world that didn't actually exist. If I had told you something different about my work earlier, would this conversation be different? His father didn't flinch. Yes. And that is exactly why I didn't, I said. Daniel was staring at me now, seeing a version of me he only half recognized. Emily. There are things about my work that aren't easily explained in a few sentences, I told his parents. I didn't feel the need to lead with them tonight. Then perhaps now is the time, his father insisted. Before I could speak, the phone vibrated again. Same number. Same urgency. Excuse me. I stood up, but this time I didn't walk away. I stood right there, in the center of their pristine living room. Yes, ma'am, the situation is escalating. We need confirmation on next steps now. I didn't lower my voice. I didn't hide. Proceed with containment. Authorize full response. I will take command the moment I arrive. Yes, ma'am. I ended the call and looked at the faces around me. No one spoke. The administrative clerk they had spent the evening patronizing had vanished. In her place was the woman who actually kept the machine running. I didn't rush to sit down. I simply stood there, letting them process the fact that the room they were sitting in and the world they thought they understood had just changed completely. Daniel was looking at me as if seeing me for the first time. His father finally cleared his throat, his posture now rigid. That sounded significant. It is, I said. Care to elaborate? I folded my hands. I handle situations that require coordination. Mark let out a dry, disbelieving laugh. That's one way to put it. I met his gaze. It's an accurate one. His smirk was gone. Daniel shifted, his voice barely a whisper. Emily, what exactly is going on? I turned to him, the soft cotton of my faded dress a stark contrast to the authority in my eyes. The dinner was over, but the conversation was just beginning. There's an issue at the base, I said, my voice steady and devoid of the previous evening's softness. It's being managed. Daniel looked at me, his brow furrowing in confusion. You said you'd take command, he replied quietly, as if trying to reconcile the woman he knew with the authority I was currently projecting. Yes. That single word shifted the gravity of the room. I felt it land not just with Daniel, but with everyone at the table. His mother, who had been treating me like a delicate social accessory, set her cup down with newfound precision. You're in charge of something like that, she asked, her voice hovering between skepticism and intrigue. Sometimes, I replied. His father was no longer looking through me. He was studying me now. The dismissive haze was gone, replaced by a sharp, calculating focus. That isn't typical for administrative personnel, he noted. No, I agreed, meeting his gaze without blinking. It isn't. Another pause stretched between us. He waited for me to fill it, perhaps expecting me to deflect or offer a humble explanation to soften the blow. But this time, I didn't move. I didn't offer a polite smile to ease his discomfort. I didn't come here tonight to mislead anyone, I said calmly. But I also didn't feel the need to introduce myself by my title. Daniel's voice was even quieter now, laced with a dawning realization. What title, Emily? I turned to him fully. For the first time since I had stepped into this house, I let the mask of the quiet girlfriend drop completely. I answered without holding anything back. I am a 2-star general, I said, my words deliberate. In the United States Army. The words settled into the room like a physical weight, heavy, real, and utterly impossible to ignore. Mark, Daniel's brother, blinked once, then twice, his mouth slightly agape, as if he were waiting for a punchline that was never going to come. Daniel's mother remained perfectly still, frozen in place. His father simply stared, his analytical mind clearly racing to recatalog every interaction we'd had so far. You're serious, he finally said after a long moment. Yes, sir. I am. The silence that followed was different from the strained quiet of earlier. It wasn't tense or uncertain anymore. It was undeniable. There are certain truths that leave no room for interpretation, and this was one of them. Mark leaned back slowly in his chair, the cocky smirk he'd worn all night finally extinguished. That's not exactly something people usually leave out of a conversation, he muttered. I wasn't trying to hide it, I said. I just didn't think it should be the thing that defined our conversation. He gave a short, dry laugh, though it lacked his previous confidence. Well, it kind of does now. I didn't respond to that, mainly because he wasn't wrong. Across from me, Daniel's mother finally found her voice, though she chose her words with extreme care. You're telling us, she said, that you command troops? Yes, ma'am. How many? Enough that it matters. The answer wasn't intended to be evasive, it was meant to be respectful of the scale of my responsibility. She absorbed the information slowly, her eyes scanning me as if seeing me for the first time. And you've been sitting here this entire time, presenting yourself as someone who works in administration, I finished gently. Which is still true, just not the whole picture. Her assessment was different now. The dismissiveness was gone, replaced by a profound, silent reevaluation. His father exhaled a long, quiet breath and leaned back into his chair. I see, he said. 2 simple words, but they carried the weight of a man realizing his calculations were entirely off base. Daniel hadn't said a word. I turned toward him again. I didn't tell you everything, I said, my voice softening just for him. And I understand if that feels like a breach of trust. He looked at me, his expression caught in a complex web of disbelief and something deeper, perhaps a bit of awe, perhaps a bit of hurt. You told me enough, he said slowly. I just didn't realize how much more there was. That's fair. Why not just say it, he asked, searching my eyes. Because I needed to know something first. What? I met his gaze, refusing to look away. You were when none of it mattered. He held my stare for a long moment, the world around us falling away. Finally, he nodded once. He wasn't fully satisfied, but he understood the necessity of the test. His father leaned forward again, resting his elbows on his knees, the posture of a man ready to talk business. You understand how this looks from our perspective, he said. I do. You come into our home, present yourself one way, and then I present myself as I am, I countered calmly. I simply provided the identity without the context. That's not a small omission. No, I agreed. It isn't. He studied me carefully, his eyes narrowing. And what exactly were you hoping to learn? I weighed the question before answering. Whether I would be treated with respect, I said, before any titles were involved. The honesty of that statement hit harder than anything else I had said that evening. It wasn't about power or position, it was about something far more fundamental and revealing. His mother shifted slightly, her posture losing some of its rigid formality. "We didn't mean any disrespect," she said, though the words sounded a bit hollow even to her. "I know," I replied. "But you have to understand," she continued, "we were trying to evaluate." "Me," I said, finishing her sentence. "Yes. And now?" I asked. She hesitated. The evaluation had changed not just the outcome, but the entire direction of the metric they were using. Mark cleared his throat, trying to break the heavy atmosphere. "Well, I guess that explains the urgent phone calls." "Yes," I said. "And the taking command part," he added. "Yes." He shook his head slowly, a look of genuine surprise on his face. "Didn't see that one coming." "That was the point," I said quietly. The room settled again, but there was no going back to how things were. Once assumptions are shattered, they can never be rebuilt in the same shape. After a moment, Daniel's father stood up and walked toward the window, looking out at the darkening yard. "I may have misjudged you," he said, his back still turned to us. It wasn't a full apology yet, but it was movement. And in a house like this, movement was everything. I nodded once. We all make judgments. The question is what we do after we realize they were wrong. He turned slightly, considering that. Daniel's mother looked at me again, and there was no trace of the dismissive socialite left. There was only reconsideration, and perhaps a flicker of something quieter, respect. I picked up my cup and took a slow sip. The coffee had gone cold, but it didn't matter. The evening had shifted from a performance of social hierarchies into something far more real. It was that raw moment after the truth is revealed, when people have to decide who they are going to be next. For a long while, no one spoke. It wasn't the strained, awkward silence from earlier. It was heavier, more deliberate. Daniel's father remained by the window, his hand resting lightly on the frame, his shoulders losing that rigid certainty. Mark looked down at his empty cup, likely recalibrating every arrogant comment he'd made over the last hour. And Daniel? He hadn't moved. He was still focused on me, his expression quieter than I had ever seen it, not angry, just processing the sheer magnitude of the woman sitting beside him. I set my cup down gently on the saucer. "I didn't mean to create a situation," I said. "That wasn't my intention." Daniel's mother shook her head slowly. "You didn't." "Not exactly. But you did show us something we weren't expecting." "That's fair," I conceded. Mark let out a short breath, a self-aware smile tugging at his lips. "I'll be honest. I feel a little ridiculous." "That wasn't the goal either," I said. Across the room, Daniel's father turned back toward us. "I think," he said carefully, "we may have approached this the wrong way." He walked back to the table, his pace slower, more thoughtful, and took his seat. "I've spent most of my life evaluating people quickly. It's a habit born of business and negotiations. You learn to assess value, risk, and potential in an instant." I listened in silence. "And tonight," he continued, his gaze meeting mine, "I did exactly that. But I did it without all the information." "Yes, sir," I said quietly. "You did." There was no accusation in my voice, only the flat resonance of truth. He exhaled slowly. "And I let that judgment shape how I treated you." The silence stretched a little longer this time because we were no longer talking about titles or jobs. We were talking about responsibility and character. Daniel shifted beside me. "Dad." But his father raised a hand, silencing him gently. "I don't like being wrong, Daniel. But I dislike the idea of being unfair even more." He looked at me with a new level of sincerity. "I don't like knowing I was unfair to you." I nodded. "That matters." His mother looked between us, her expression finally softening. "We weren't trying to be unkind," she whispered. "I know," I replied. "But we were," she admitted. It was the first real moment of accountability, delivered without defensiveness. Daniel leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "I should have said something earlier," he said, looking at me. "When I saw where the conversation was heading." "You tried," I reminded him. "Not enough," he insisted. I didn't argue. Growth doesn't come from being coddled. It comes from awareness. He looked at me again, really seeing me. "I didn't fully understand the scope of what you do. Not like this." "That's on me," I said. I chose to withhold that explanation. "Why?" he asked again, his voice barely a whisper. I took a deep breath. Because I needed to know if you saw me before you saw the stars on my shoulder. And I held his gaze. I think you're still figuring that out. He flinched slightly, then nodded. That's fair. Mark cleared his throat, trying to lighten the mood. So, just to be clear, you're actually in charge of an entire base? Yes. And those calls were part of the job. He let out a low whistle. And I made a joke about you doing paperwork. I remember, I said. He winced. Yeah, about that. It's all right, I said. You were working with the information you had. That's not much of an excuse, he countered. No, I agreed. But it is an explanation. Daniel's mother reached for her cup, her movements more fluid and less rehearsed. I think, she said, we've spent a long time measuring people by things that are easy to see. And we forgot that not everything important presents itself that way. She met my eyes directly. That is our failing, not yours. I inclined my head slightly in acknowledgement. It takes a certain level of awareness to recognize that. It took you showing us, she said. Maybe, I replied. But the result is what matters. Daniel's father leaned forward, his tone steadier. You said you wanted to see who we were before we knew who you were. And now you have. What have you concluded? The question wasn't defensive. It was a direct request for my assessment. I considered my words with the same care I would a post-mission brief. I think you care deeply about your son, I began. And you want to protect the life he's built. But I also think you rely too heavily on visible markers to determine a person's worth. And that leads to incomplete, and often incorrect, conclusions. The room was silent. The simplest truths are often the hardest to hear. You're not wrong, he said finally. I've spent decades building a certain way of thinking. It doesn't change overnight. I wouldn't expect it to, I said. But it can change, he added. Yes. That word felt like the true turning point of the night. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about what came next. Daniel reached for my hand, his grip gentle but intentional. I'm still here, Emily, he said quietly. I know, I replied. And I'm not going anywhere. I looked at him for a long moment, testing the weight of his words. Then stand with me. It wasn't a demand or a test, it was just the truth of what I required. He nodded firmly. I will. The tension that had suffocated the house earlier had dissipated. It wasn't replaced by immediate comfort. That would take time, but it was replaced by honesty. As the evening drew to a close, the atmosphere felt clearer. Clarity doesn't erase the past, but it provides the foundation to build something new. When we stood to leave, Daniel's mother walked us to the door. Thank you for coming, Emily, she said. Thank you for having me, I replied, and this time, the exchange felt sincere. She hesitated at the threshold. We'd like to see you again soon. Truly. I nodded. I'd like that. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp. Daniel opened the car door for me, but the gesture felt different, less like a practiced habit and more like a conscious act of presence. As I settled into the seat, I looked back at the house one last time. The drive back to my apartment was quiet. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, his jaw set in that way men do when they are deep in thought. I appreciated the silence. A careless sentence can bruise more deeply than a harsh truth, especially after a night like this. For most, the evening would have felt like a triumph. I had been underestimated, and then I had been vindicated. I had seen their certainty crack. But I didn't feel victorious. I felt tired. It was the quiet kind of exhaustion that comes when you realize love isn't just about how two people feel for each other. It's about whether they can stand together when the world tries to pull them apart. I should have told them more before tonight, Daniel finally said as we stopped at a red light. I looked at him. Not my rank. That wasn't yours to share. But I should have prepared them. Or at least warned you more clearly about how they can be. I had a sense of it. That's not the same as being ready for it. The light turned green, and he drove on. After a few blocks, he asked, Were you testing me too? I took my time before answering. Yes. He absorbed that without flinching. I figured. I wasn't trying to trap you, Daniel. I know. But you needed to see if I'd let you sit there alone. That one hit him hard. I saw the pain flash in his eyes even in the dim glow of the dashboard. I did, he whispered. Not completely. But enough. I didn't offer a platitude. There is no kindness in pretending a mistake didn't happen. Yes. Enough. He swallowed hard and nodded. One thing I always respected about Daniel was his ability to be honest with himself once the truth found him. I froze, he admitted. I kept thinking if I pushed back too hard, it would just make the situation worse. A common mistake, I said softly. He gave a sad, small laugh. That sounds like something you'd say in a military briefing. It probably is. For the first time all night, a small spark of warmth passed between us before fading back into the gravity of the situation. I love my parents, he said. But I saw them clearly tonight. I saw what they were doing. And what were they doing? They were measuring you against a yardstick that doesn't matter. And I let them. He pulled into my building's parking lot, but left the engine running. I don't want a marriage where you have to defend yourself alone, Emily. I don't want you to feel like you have to hide here just to fit in with my family. I didn't hide because of them, I reminded him. I withheld because of what I needed to learn. He turned to me then, his expression raw. And what did you learn about me? I looked at him for a long moment. That you love me. But love needs a backbone, Daniel. He looked down at his hands. That's fair. It isn't meant to wound you. I know, he said. But maybe it should. That answer stayed with me. Sometimes a wound isn't a punishment. It's the place where growth begins. 2 days passed before his mother called. I was in my office at the base, surrounded by the hum of activity, when my assistant knocked. Ma'am, Daniel's mother is on your personal line. I was surprised. Thank you. Put her through. A moment later, her voice came over the line. Emily? Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. There was a long pause. Please. Call me Patricia. I leaned back in my chair. All right, Patricia. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. You're not. I wanted to apologize. Properly. I said nothing. Not to be cruel, but because an apology needs space to breathe. Too often, people rush to forgive just to end the discomfort of the moment. I judged you before I knew you, she continued, her voice wavering slightly. I asked questions that sounded polite but were meant to diminish you. I made assumptions about your worth based on an address, a job title, and my own narrow definition of success. I appreciate you saying that, I said. I've been thinking about it constantly. Harold has too, though he's much slower to admit when he's been a fool. I smiled faintly. I understand. I don't expect you to forget how we acted. I wouldn't. No, I said softly. I suppose I shouldn't. Would you consider coming to dinner again? Just you and Daniel. No extra guests, no interrogation. Just dinner. I looked out my office window at the flag snapping in the afternoon wind. I would consider it, I said. That's more than I deserve. Perhaps. But it's enough for a start. That Sunday, Daniel came over to pick me up. He didn't bring excuses. He brought a tired but genuine smile. We didn't head straight to his parents'. We sat at my kitchen table first, eating takeout from a local Italian place. Mom called you, he said halfway through the meal. She did. She told me she apologized. She did. He nodded, looking relieved. Dad wants to talk too. In person. It'll be harder for him. I know. Are you ready for that? He looked at me with a steady gaze. I'm ready to stand beside you this time. No freezing. No excuses. I believed he meant it. But life has taught me that intentions are only the first step. The real test is what happens when the pressure returns. I reached across the table and took his hand. We'll see, I said. The second dinner was entirely different. I didn't wear the faded dress, nor did I wear my uniform. I chose a simple gray blouse and slacks, just me. When we arrived, Harold opened the door himself. He looked smaller, somehow, less like a man armored by his own status and more like a human being. Emily, he said, stepping aside. Please come in. The house was the same, but the atmosphere had shifted. There were no performative table settings, no distant cousins. Patricia greeted me with a hug that was slightly awkward but entirely sincere. The meal was simple, pot roast and vegetables. Real food. We talked about the weather, Daniel's work, and the mundane details of life. Then, Harold set his fork down. I owe you an apology, Emily, he said, looking me directly in the eye. I measured you by the wrong things. Worse, I let my pride make me comfortable doing it. I listened, my hands resting in my lap. I've spent years telling myself I'm a good judge of character, he continued. But that night, I wasn't judging character. I was judging status. And the truth is, if you hadn't turned out to be someone important, I might never have realized my mistake. That was the most honest thing he could have said. It reached me because it acknowledged the core of the problem. That matters more than the apology, I told him. He looked confused for a moment. You recognized that you would have owed the same respect to an administrative worker as you do to a general, I explained. His face tightened with emotion. Yes, that is what I am trying to learn. The dinner ended without tension. As Daniel and I walked out onto the porch, Patricia followed us. Her smile wasn't measured or polite, it was soft and a little uncertain. I'm glad you came, she said. So am I replied. And I meant it. Reconciliation isn't always warm and fuzzy at first. Sometimes, it's just two sides choosing not to walk away. Harold stood in the doorway and gave a small, respectful nod as we left. The drive home felt different. The silence between Daniel and me was no longer heavy with things unsaid. It was settled. It was thoughtful. It was the beginning of something real. After a few minutes, he reached over and took my hand, his eyes staying fixed on the road ahead. They meant it, he said, his voice quiet but certain. I know. I've never seen my dad talk like that before. He doesn't usually admit when he's out of step. People change, I said, watching the streetlights flicker past, when they are finally willing to see themselves clearly. He let out a long, slow breath. I almost didn't. I almost let the pressure get to me. I turned toward him, searching his profile in the dim light of the dashboard. But you did. Because of you. No, I said gently, because you chose to. There's a difference. That mattered. I realized then that change forced by someone else rarely lasts. It's just a temporary mask. But change that is chosen, earned through the discomfort of self-reflection, is the kind that stays. He nodded slightly, as if storing that thought away for the future. I don't ever want to put you in that position again, he said firmly. You will, I replied calmly. He blinked, surprised. What? I smiled faintly. Not in that exact way, perhaps. But life has a way of testing people in many different forms. We never truly stop being tested. He sat with that for a moment, absorbing the weight of the truth. So, what do I do when it happens again? Stand sooner, I said. Speak earlier. Don't wait for things to become uncomfortable before you decide what it is you actually believe. He was quiet for a long moment, processing. Then he nodded. I can do that. I believe you can. A few weeks passed. Life returned to its usual, demanding rhythm. There were early mornings, long days, and brief phone calls that carried more weight than words. I felt the steady, heavy responsibility that came with a role I had never once taken lightly. At the base, nothing had changed on the surface. Rank still mattered. Decisions still carried life-altering consequences. People still stood at attention when I entered a room. But something inside me had settled differently. Outside of that structured world, beyond the gates, the uniforms, and the protocol, I had been reminded of something vital: who you are when none of that is visible. And, more importantly, how people treat you when they have no idea what you can do for them. One afternoon, while I was reviewing a stack of sensitive reports, my assistant stepped into the office. Ma'am, you have a visitor. I glanced up, my mind still buried in the data. Who is it? A Mr. Whitmore. I paused for a fraction of a second, the name echoing in the quiet room. Send him in. Harold stepped into my office with a level of formality I hadn't seen before. It wasn't stiff or awkward, just deeply respectful. General, he said, his voice steady. Mr. Whitmore. He looked around the room briefly, taking in the framed commendations, the flags, the maps, and the quiet, disciplined order of the command center. This is impressive, he said. It's functional, I replied. He gave a small, acknowledging nod and sat down when I gestured to the chair across from my desk. I didn't come to take up much of your time, he began. You're here. That means it matters. He accepted that. For a moment, he seemed to be searching for the right words, his usual air of effortless confidence replaced by a thoughtful humility. I've been thinking a lot, he finally said, about that night. About how easily I made up my mind about you based on nothing but my own assumptions. I listened, giving him the silence he needed to continue. I built a career on reading people, he said. And I got comfortable, far too comfortable, believing I was the best at it. That happens to the best of us, Harold. But I wasn't reading you, he said, meeting my eyes directly. I was reading what I expected to see. I saw a vacuum and filled it with my own biases. That's more common than you think. He nodded slowly. I wanted to thank you. That took me by surprise. For what? For not using your position to make a point. You could have embarrassed me the moment you walked through the door. You could have ended the argument with a title. I leaned back slightly in my chair. That wouldn't have taught anyone anything. No, he agreed. It would have just made me defensive. And being defensive isn't the same as learning. He let out a quiet breath, looking relieved to have finally said it. Exactly. There was a brief pause. Then he added, I've been trying to look at people differently since then. How so? By asking myself one question first. I waited. And what is that? What if I'm wrong? I nodded, a genuine sense of respect for him growing. That's a very good place to start. When he left, I sat there for a few minutes longer than usual. I wasn't thinking about the next meeting or the next mission. I was just reflecting. In all my years of service, I had learned a great deal about leadership, about responsibility, and about making hard choices when the cost of being wrong was high. But that night, and the grace that followed, had reminded me of a deeper truth. Leadership doesn't begin with authority. It begins with how you see people. It begins with whether you give them the dignity of being more than your first impression. A month later, Daniel and I stood together at a small family gathering. It was nothing formal, just a backyard barbecue at his parents' house. This time, there were no pointed questions about my career. No careful evaluations or quiet tests. Instead, Patricia handed me a plate with a warm smile and asked about my week. Mark, still looking a little sheepish about his previous behavior, kept his jokes light and harmless. And Harold? Harold simply treated me as part of the family. Not because of the stars on my shoulders, but because of who I had shown myself to be, and because of who he had chosen to become. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden shadows across the lawn, Daniel stepped closer to me. He rested his hand lightly on the small of my back. You were right, he said softly. About what? That night wasn't about proving who you are. I looked at him, feeling a deep sense of peace. It was about showing who everyone else was. I smiled. And what we all chose to do after that. He nodded, his grip tightening slightly in a silent show of support. And I'm glad we didn't walk away. So am I. If there is one thing I have learned, it is this. People will show you exactly who they are when they think you have nothing to offer them. That quiet, unguarded moment is where the truth lives. But what matters even more is what happens next, whether they stay the same, or whether they choose to grow. And whether you are willing to give them the space to do it. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been judged too quickly or had to face your own assumptions, take a moment to reflect on it. And if you believe stories like this matter, consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder. Because sometimes, the smallest shift in how we see one another can change everything.